How's it going, everyone? All right, this is it. The moment that you've all been waiting for. Corbin's experience in the Qliphoth and his understanding of how that affected him and his... Can I stop talking in third person now? How it affected me and how I experienced it at an individual level. All theory and philosophy aside, actual experience. So the first thing that I noticed, and keep in mind that this isn't my first time around. Just because I started posting videos about a month ago about this, doesn't mean that's when I started this process. I've been doing the dance for about a decade now, and now that I have been through 3 times, I feel confident that I have a pretty decent grasp on how it affects me, at least for now. The first 2 times I went through, there was some differences, and I wasn't sure how to attribute those differences and what to attribute them to. So I wanted to go through one more time before I started all of this so that I could extract the sort of meta experience. The first thing that I noticed was that it was extremely familiar. And I don't just mean that it was familiar because I'd done this before. It was familiar in a part of my life and in a place and time before I had even started all of this stuff. There were parts of there were certain Qlipha that I vividly remember feeling the same energy and having similar experiences when I was 7, 8 years old. Some of the entities that I have met along the way are energies that I've known for a long time and just didn't know their name. So that's the first thing that I want to address. We've all been there, more than likely, at some point in our life. We just didn't know what to call it. We didn't know how to say what we were going through, or why we were going through what we were going through. So that's the first thing that I want to make very, very loud and clear. Life initiates us through the Qliphoth. At different points, in different places, at different times. And you might find, if you take this journey, that it's very familiar at certain times, and at other times it is completely foreign. Of course, your mileage may vary. So let's run through the individual Qliphoth now. The first one that I want to discuss is, we'll start from the top and we'll work our way down. These might sound similar in certain places, but there are subtle nuances. There are just subtle things that are just different, even though they might sound similar. So let's start with Thaumiel. With Thaumiel, I had experiences with the voices in my head, essentially. I've always had 2 voices in my head other than the voice I hear when I read something. There's always been, ever since I can remember, a voice of doubt and a voice of hope. And that was... It was about integrating those 2 voices and finding resolution between them and realizing that they're the same voice. Perhaps one is from the past and one is from the future. It's really hard to explain. One way that I might equate it is people explain that anxiety is you living in the future, and depression is you living in the past. It's not exactly that, but that's what I'm talking to. We are multidimensional beings. We exist in multiple places at multiple times at once. And it seems to me as though with the voices of hope and doubt, the doubts are coming from things that we have already experienced. And hope is coming from things that we want to experience. And this is sort of a nod to what one of our guests, John, and I were discussing, that this structure is a portal to different places and times. It's not just like a house with different rooms. It can be likened to that. But imagine that this house is spread over different states and different time periods, and there's different species living in there. It's really hard to explain, and I apologize for digressing so deeply, but it really is hard to get a grip on it. But I would say mostly that the experience for Thaumiel for me was integrating the two halves of my being, which is to be expected because Theomim in Hebrew it means twins, and Theom means something like chaos. So Thaumiel is sort of like the chaos god, or the twins of God is a way that you can think about it. Okay, so the next one, Ghagiel. What I experienced in Ghagiel was bouts of anxiety and depression, which is not something I'm a stranger to. I was diagnosed with manic depression as a teenager. Periods of extreme energy and then periods of just no energy, no interest whatsoever. And with this experience, again, this is all going to be, or I'll say it has been for me an integration process, because these are the unbalanced forces. You're going to notice that there's a dichotomy to every single one of these in my experience. So for Ghagiel, it was anxiety and depression, which makes sense because it's that force of life. It's the chaya, the chi, the vril. So it comes in, and when it's unbalanced, it comes in too strong, and that's like the anxiety for me. And then when it switches off, there's less, and that's the depression. And this may be different for other people, but I'm sharing my experience. I haven't really seen or heard people really go into this deeply, and maybe because it's so personal that it's not applicable. But if enough of us can share our experiences, perhaps we can find something common between them. So the next one is Satariel. For me, Satariel had a lot to do with either oversharing things or just having the impulse to lie about them. Which makes sense because Satariel deals with concealment. I found myself, perhaps I could explain it better with a story. I would, or an example, somebody would ask me something about what I've been up to lately. And I would either start from yesterday and then find myself working back a month, and the person's eyes are just glazed over. Or they would ask me what I was up to, and I would just have this impulse to lie. Not to exaggerate the circumstance, although when I was much younger, I used to exaggerate like crazy, and I was a compulsive liar. But in this round, it was more about like, I wanted to completely tell them that I was up to something entirely different to sort of preserve that energy and silence, practicing silence essentially, but almost a transverse form of silence. So moving on, getting to Gha'agshevlah, what I call Gha'agshevlah, which there's some of my personal experience in there. It to me is Shevlah, not Sheblah, and that is because Sheva is 7 in Hebrew, and it's the 7th hell. If Hesed is the 7th heaven, I suppose it's the 7th hell. So Sheva, Shevlah. That's just a personal thing that I have taken to, to each their own. In Gha'agshevlah, it was an oscillation between trying to control the overly control situations, micromanaging essentially. It was an oscillation between micromanaging and just not caring at all, not caring enough about things that I should. And it's Astaroth actually told me, and the way that you can interpret that is either the cosmic entity, principality that rules over this sphere, or you can take it as the part of my psyche that relates to that energy. I sort of take it as both. Why does it exist within me? Well, because it's a principality somewhere at a higher plane. So when I was in communication with Astaroth, I'll say, one thing that was shared to me, it was beautifully put. They said it's the iron fist that crushes what it loves the most. No, it's the iron fist that crushes what it holds most dear. And I could not explain my experience in that sphere in a better way. It's the iron fist that crushes what it holds most dearly. So an oscillation between micromanaging and just disinterest and dissociation, almost. So moving on, I will get to the Abyss. I realize I skipped the Abyss. I'm going to cover that last. So moving on to Golachab. That was the toughest. It often is the toughest sphere for most people. But I was, and I'm not trying to make excuses here. And perhaps this is an excuse, but I don't mean for it to be. I was raised by someone that had anger issues. So somewhere along that circuit, and it doesn't justify that I allowed myself to act out on the impulses of anger, but somewhere deep within me, it was encoded that more anger was allowed than should be. So getting through Golachab for me was rough. I actually got into a fist fight, which has not happened since I was a teenager. I tend to be able to resolve things. I study conflict resolution. I do counseling part-time. So conflict resolution is something that I have just drilled into the back of my skull. But I just felt compelled when the person got in my face. I could have easily taken a step back, gotten in my car, laughed it off and drove away. But the second they got in my face, it's like this switch turned on. And quite frankly, I took it a little bit too far. And that is something that, perhaps I am still working through, but I had a similar situation happen today, actually, and it was like cool, calm, calculated. The person tried to engage me, and I just completely, it was like blinders and like earmuffs. It was like I just like laughed it off. And so Perhaps that means that I worked through some of my blockages. Perhaps it was just a less intense situation. But in Golachab, I went back and forth between being just so angry about things that were, it was just like, in retrospect, it's like, what were you doing? Like, you're just wasting energy and time. And so I would go back and forth between being overly angry and like trying to appease people, like going out of my way to make sure that like people were happy and placated. I guess I'm not really sure another word off the top of my head, but just overly compensating for other people and trying to make sure that they wouldn't be angry, I guess. And oftentimes they were just like, dude, it's fine. Like, don't worry about it. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And then I would have to watch for that, oscillation. So yes, moving on to Thagirion. This sphere for me was 100% about ego and power. And finding a balance between higher will and personal will. That was a big struggle for me. Ego is something that I'm always trying to figure out how much to indulge in, and perhaps indulge is the wrong word, but partake in. I've always struggled with who and where the boundary of me is, and this was a lot about finding that sense of center, knowing how I would react in a situation accurately. If someone asked me, what would you do? It was like, I knew what I would do. I didn't have to think about it. And I felt resolution. I felt resolve when I would answer them. How would you? And I would do this. And, there's just that sense of congruent resonance throughout that feels to me like resolution. So balancing out the drive for power and control that is associated with ego. And that was totally on par with what I would expect in retrospect, because to me, the other side of Thagirion, Tifereth, is all about balance and delegation. And so it was all like, I wanted to, and this is what I was talking about. There's echoes, because these are emanations of each other, but there's slight variations. So Thagirion was a little bit like Gha'agshevlah, because my ego was flaring up and it wanted to have power and control, but it wasn't so much micromanaging as it was higher up. Moving on into Orab Zaraq. So Orab Zaraq is another one that is extremely difficult for me. And perhaps it's because a reflection of Golachab. And perhaps Golachab is tough for me because of what I experienced in Orab Zaraq and it being a reflection. It depends how you look at it. But for me, Orab Zaraq was all about addiction and guilt. I struggled with drug addiction when I was younger, and had actually not used drugs at all for a 3-year period. When I say that I was addicted to drugs, I was addicted to things that don't grow out of the ground, things that have to be processed and are less natural. And I got away from that like 15 or 16 years ago. It's been a very, very long time. But I still would ingest natural things like mushrooms and cannabis, basically, and various other entheogens. And until about 3 years ago. And then I just sort of took a break from it all. And then I got into Orab Zaraq, and it was like something happened, and my first solution was, oh, I'm gonna hit up this person, and I'm gonna go grab some bud. And it was just like, yeah, like that's what you should do. That's a good idea. And it had been 3 years since I had even considered, and I hang out with people that smoke. My best friend smokes, and he smokes around me, and it doesn't bother me because I have found other things that just sort of fill that gap and give me a similar perspective and mindset. But for some reason, I got into Orab Zaraq, and that thing happened. Basically, there was a lot of stress with school, and I had a deadline, and I was trying to contact my instructor, and they weren't getting back with me. And I, for some reason, felt like I was going to get kicked out of school. Oh, I remember. It was trying to figure out when my first classes were, and at the time I thought that I had to attend every class, or I would fail, and I was going to get kicked out. And I had missed orientation and the first class, and I couldn't get a hold of this instructor, and I was just stressing me out because I got a student loan, and that's a decent amount of money, and I had a lot of my future riding on getting this degree. So it just seemed like everything was coming unfurled. And despite all of the relaxation and meditation and breathing techniques that I have used over the years and trained dozens of other people in, my first instinct was, yeah, I'm going to get high. And there was never that voice that was like, well, wait a minute. It was just like, yeah, that's definitely a good idea. That's what you should do. And who knows, perhaps that has affected me some way down the road that was the correct choice. But it was just so out of left field for me. And then whenever that happened, it perhaps, as I said earlier, depression pertaining to the past, guilt also pertains to the past. So I don't know if it's because I ingested something from my past and it was bringing up things from the past, or if passion, I think addiction is related to passion, and I think guilt and passion are related. So I think that's where the thread is between these two, between addiction and guilt. But just things from my past that I had already forgiven myself for. The people that I had hurt had already forgiven me for. It came up and started bothering me again. And it was like, man, I've already been through this. And it wasn't just that it was coming up, it affected me the way that it affected me in the past. I felt really crappy about myself. And I was like, man, how could I do that? And, how could I allow myself to